This is the true story of how the most prosperous nation on earth became inundated with drugs and how the DEA and CIA littered our cities. But most importantly, how the powerful profited, especially the Clintons.
We had nothing, zero, to do with it, and everybody who's ever looked into it knows that.
You're dealing with an international cocaine smuggler who moved his entire Air Force, basically, to the state of Arkansas. Everybody in law enforcement that was involved knew.
When the election came up, the issue of this investigation came up with it. And the question of $25,000 was brought up by somebody, I don't know who. And Governor Clinton said that he had offered $25,000.
In my opinion, based on my 15 years of prosecutorial experience, there's no reason or justification why that evidence was never presented to the grand jury.
I just said, you know what, they're bringing back, and I'm cursing, what on those blank airplanes. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, they're bringing back coke. And he says, oh, no, wait a minute. He throws his hands up and said, that's last year's deal. And I knew that, that the only time I'd ever seen the governor around eating cocaine was at Dan Laster's house, when it was on the table when I got him out of there.
How did a small town in Arkansas supply inner cities with billions of dollars in drugs? How did the government fail to stop it? My name is Ron Chapman. I've spent thousands of hours investigating the Clinton cartel connection in Mena, Arkansas. This information in this episode and future episodes related to the Clintons is sourced and vetted from prominent news outlets, reporters, DEA and CIA documents, and personal accounts. Certain facts are indisputable. On July 29, 1994, more than a year after former federal judge Nicholas J. Bua told the Justice Department there was no credible evidence that the government stole or trafficked the case management software called PROMIS, House leaders went the other way. They introduced H.R. 4862 to compensate Inslaw, the company that was affected, and reaffirmed verbatim their findings, determining that justice officials took, verted, and stole Inslaw's enhanced software by trickery, fraud, and deceit, while also documenting subpoenaed records at the Department of Justice. The House's text pointedly added that the appellate reversal in Inslaw versus United States turned on jurisdiction, not on whether the theft occurred. In short, two branches, two different stories. Now, why is the Inslaw affair so important? Why is the congressional inconsistency so important? Well, that'll take us directly to Mena, Arkansas, the PROMIS software and international money laundering. This episode follows four braided strands that reoccur across the entire case. First, PROMIS, Inslaw, a software, was stolen from a company and used to facilitate trafficking. Mena, Arkansas, was the airfield where Barry Seal, a CIA informant, trafficked. Systematics, the program linked to the Rose law firm, was used to facilitate those transactions according to sources. Now let's picture a quiet mountain airfield in western Arkansas, a couple of nondescript hangars that look built for crop dusters and weekend Cessnas. That's Mena Intermountain Airport. If you take locals at their word and paperwork at its face value, this out-of-the-way runway sat at the crossroads of airplanes, cash, code names, and a kind of bureaucratic amnesia that only appears when powerful people would rather you stop asking questions. Let's talk about Barry Seal. Barry Seal was a pilot who made himself indispensable to people on both sides of the law, no doubt about that. He flew heavy, he flew low, he flew often, smuggler by trade, cooperating asset by convenience, and logistics man by temperament. From early 1980s until his death in 1986, he used the Mena airport to modify aircraft, stage flights, and close trafficking loops. He left behind more lore than he left receipts. Bank slips, aircraft logs, avionics work orders, fuel invoices, personal planners, taped calls, and handwritten code legends all lead to him being a trafficker. The money moved like this. Whenever Seal flew in, Stacks of currency showed up. Secretaries and airport staff were told to break that currency into cashier's checks, just under the $10,000 reporting threshold. Tellers later told grand jurors about a suitcase with more than $70,000 parceled down the line. Offshore accounts pinged across the Caribbean and Central America. He used corporate shells. On his desk sat plans for Royale Empire, Royale Security, Royale Resorts, Royale Liquors, Royale Television, Royale Pharmaceuticals, all paper shells to funnel his money for a much bigger operation than a pilot's salary. The volume, not a few bricks and a handshake. We're talking shipments measured by the pallet and proceeds measured by the truckload. Arkansas State Police investigator Russell Welsh and IRS criminal investigator Bill Duncan were hot on his trail.
Meeting at State Police headquarters in Little Rock, and it was agreed that since I had worked for Clinton in the past as a campaign worker for him and had personally talked with him before, it was decided that I should approach him with a request for whatever assistance was available on the state level. And so I did so. And hand-delivered a request to him the following week. I told him, or said in the letter, that at least $25,000 would be required to start a proper investigation. And he told me that he would get a man on it and would get word back to me. I never heard word back from him in any fashion.
Welsh kept showing up in Mina until he knew every mechanic by first name. Duncan counted the dollars while everyone else argued about airplanes.
In approximately March or April of 1983, I was in the United States Attorney's office in Fort Smith, Arkansas. At that time, the U.S. Attorney was Asa Hutchinson. During a meeting with him on another matter, DE Agent Jim Stepp, who was also in the office, requested that I look into Barry Seal, who had moved his cocaine smuggling operation from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to Mena, Arkansas. Mr. Stepp told me that he was laundering large amounts of cash and making large expenditures with cash.
In 1983, I was made aware that Sheriff Hadaway and one of his auxiliary deputies, Terry Capehart, were investigating a smuggling operation going on at the Mena airport that Barry Seal had there at Rich Mountain Aviation, where there was only one purpose for them. There's only one use for that type of aircraft, and that was smuggle cocaine. They had special cargo doors installed in the side without FAA permission so that these doors could be opened in flight. They'd pull in, slide back, and the cocaine could be dropped out of the side in flight. Barry or one of his pilots would fly to Mena, where there would be an airplane identical to the one they flew in, sitting there, same tail number. They would get in it. It would be loaded with enough fuel to fly to Columbia. They'd fly to Columbia, pick up cocaine, refuel, and come straight back. Somewhere over the mainland, after they would hit the Louisiana coast, somewhere between there and Mena, they would kick the cocaine out at a previously undisclosed location and give coded Loran coordinates. And then a ground crew or a helicopter would come in and pick up the cocaine.
But Duncan drafted indictments, dozens, 29 of them, tying them together. Money laundering schemes that used sleepy banks in Arkansas. And Welsh documented the traffic, people, parts, patterns, until they built a case against Barry Seal. Duncan later testified that the U.S. Attorney's Office wouldn't take his subpoenas, preventing him from building the case he wanted. He said he was told to stand down, to withhold information, to play small ball when the scoreboard said the opposite. All in all, his investigation was obstructed by powerful people. Welsh got suddenly and seriously sick in true Clinton fashion, symptoms like the inhalation of anthrax. He survived, but he certainly was given a pretty powerful message that he should stay off the trail of Barry Seal and Mena, Arkansas. This was no normal case. Now, Duncan told a congressional panel that he'd never seen anything like the interference he met when he tried to carry Mena-linked cases across the goal line to prosecution. At one point, he had 29 draft indictments. That's 29. FAA histories and corporate records show aircraft in Seal's orbit with fingerprints that raise eyebrows tracked to the CIA. Planes once owned by Air America, an entity that had a lot of CIA connections. These were birds that were outfitted by companies that did other government work, and tail numbers that show up in places far from Arkansas, with purposes far from weekend flying. It wasn't just planes and smuggling that happened in Mena, Arkansas. An Arkansas gun manufacturer testified in federal court that someone tied to U.S. intelligence ordered 250 suppressed pistols connected to the Mena pipeline. He said he had Department of Defense purchase orders, and that when a certain plane went down that we'll talk about later, everybody vanished and he was never paid. Where does Bill Clinton come into play here? As governor at the time, Bill Clinton said he learned officially about Mena in 1988, years later. He would describe it as primarily a matter for federal jurisdiction, meaning U.S. attorneys run these cases, not state prosecutors.
Sir, the Republicans are trying to blame you for the existence of a small air base at Mena, Arkansas. This base was set up by George Bush and Oliver North and the CIA to help the Iran-Contras, and they brought in plane load after plane load of cocaine there for sale in the United States. And then they took the money and bought weapons and took them back to the Contras, all of which was illegal, as you know, under the Bolin Act. But tell me, did they tell you that this had to be in existence because of national security?
Well, let me answer the question. No, they didn't tell me anything about it. They didn't say anything to me about it. The airport in question and all the events in question were the subject of state and federal inquiries. It was primarily a matter for federal jurisdiction. The state really had next to nothing to do with it. The local prosecutor did conduct an investigation based on what was within the jurisdiction of state law. The rest of it was under jurisdiction of the United States attorneys who were appointed successively by previous administrations. We had nothing, zero, to do with it, and everybody who's ever looked into it knows that.
Clinton's statement to the media that he had made $25,000 available for the investigation eventually turned out to be a lie. No attempt was ever made by Clinton to assist in the investigation.
In my opinion, based on my 15 years of prosecutorial experience, there's no reason or justification why that evidence was never presented to the grand jury. Charges should have been filed. People should have been charged or indicted. There's no question about that.
It also leaves a bad taste in everybody in Mena's mouth, because a governor who wants answers can still fund a state grand jury. In fact, there were 29 indictments. They can still order a complete accounting from his state police. He can still use the bully pulpit to demand that if training exercises are happening at a state airport, someone might say who trained, when, and why. Now let's go to February 1986. The Medellin cartel hitmen ambushed Barry Seal outside a Salvation Army halfway house in Baton Rouge, where he was waiting to testify about the cartels. He'd been ordered to stay there as a condition of probation by a federal judge while waiting to testify. This reads like rough justice until you match up the case. Right up to the end, Barry Seal behaved like a man who believed he was protected. He made calls to Mina days before he tragically died.
Bill Duncan and I interviewed Barry Seal less than 2 months before he was killed, and he was served with a subpoena at that time. He was under subpoena to come to Arkansas and testify before the grand jury here when he was killed.
Apparently, somebody in Arkansas wanted Seal dead because he was murdered before he could show up for that grand jury investigation. Very little is known about the distribution method that Seal had. We do know that one lumber truck from Mina was busted going to Kansas City. It had a lumber facade on the back. When you lifted the lumber up, there was a load of cocaine. Same driver drove the same route time and time again. Well, the owner of the lumber company was very close to Bill Clinton, Governor Clinton, Buddy Bean. They were never allowed to do a thorough investigation. The whole thing just went down the tubes.
A late 1980s FBI teletext advised Arkansas State Police that something was happening at Mena involving a contractor previously linked to CIA work. That was Barry Seal, and warned the locals not to screw it up like last time. The intelligence community has publicly said it conducted limited training at or around Mina, admitting to these facts, and hired local aviation shops for routine services. But that wasn't the whole story, ladies and gentlemen. The locals told a different story. The same runway saw drugs in, cash washed through banks, guns whispered about, and inquiries that somehow never quite got solved with an investigation. Every time allegations widened, official reviews narrowed them down, often with caveats that left the police shooting blanks. PROMIS, the prosecutor's management information system. This was a 1970s case tracking program built to help prosecutors link people, charges, witnesses, and dates across the docket. Now, that was the official story for the government contract. Inslaw, the company behind it, was tasked with developing it under DOJ contract. And in 1982, the Justice Department signed on to install PROMIS in U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. A few years later, the relationship turned into a bare-knuckle fight. Inslaw accused the DOJ of taking its enhanced software by trickery, fraud, and deceit. A bankruptcy judge later determined that that actually was the case and determined that it was deployed beyond its license and it was used by the federal government in ways it wasn't supposed to. Two federal courts sided with Inslaw, but then a special counsel review found no credible evidence of criminal wrongdoing by DOJ officials, and a later technical analysis spawned by Janet Reno determined that the justice system didn't improperly use the PROMIS software. After that review, Bill Hamilton, the owner of Inslaw, didn't stop his inquiries. He wrote letters that read like road flares pointing towards misconduct. He laid out dates, names, contract terms, installations, and what he said were missing subpoenaed records. He used the words took, converted, and stole, words a careful lawyer doesn't commit to paper unless he's prepared to live with them. He told Congress, in essence, in an affidavit and testimony, that the appellate reversal the DOJ celebrated turned on jurisdiction, not on whether the taking of the software happened. That's a nuance most people missed. And the reality is the Inslaw software was stolen. But the real problem in this case is what Bill Hamilton believed happened after that. Bill Hamilton was able to uncover through his attorneys, a former attorney general, that there were very serious problems with the sale of this software. Apparently, the software that was stolen by the DOJ was then being sold to others around the country, installed in banks to disguise international money laundering. When Bill Hamilton didn't shut up about it, he went to Congress, and after a 3-year probe, the House Judiciary Committee released a 1992 report titled The Inslaw Affair, saying that the record largely supports that government officials took and converted Inslaw's property, flagging missing or unaccounted for DOJ records during the investigation, and recommending an independent counsel be appointed. 2 years after that, House leaders introduced a bill to compensate Inslaw and its owner for the harm that the DOJ caused. Meanwhile, DOJ and the special counsel stuck to their guns. There was no evidence that this software was stolen. Very suspicious. The government narrative changes. One branch said no theft. Another said you stole it. 2 branches, 2 stories, and both answers are still sitting there in government fonts and in the official record. Now, why does a fight over a database belong in the same episode of Off Air as an Arkansas airstrip? Well, because of logistics.
Off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, stand-alone entity that could perform certain activities on behalf of the United States.
Transportation and accounting. When you sell, you've got to put the money somewhere, and you've got to transport it to the people who need it. Airplanes move product and cash. The software is a tool to track who owes whom and who's vulnerable, to track the transfer of money across the world. Later interviews with a gentleman named Rakana Shudo determined that the NSA installed a backdoor into the PROMIS software system for the purpose of disguising international money laundering. He was interviewed by Richardson and Hamilton related to the Inslaw case, and he provided an affidavit and testimony related to that effect. But if you have a software, you got to figure out a way to sell the software. That's where Systematics comes into play. Systematics, a software company that was represented by the Rose Law Firm. Famous partner of the Rose Law Firm, Hillary Rodham Clinton and Vince Foster, who was the subject of one of my prior episodes, both worked on the Systematics case. Now, Systematics is vital because if you have a software like PROMIS and you want to find a way to install it inside of banks for the purpose of concealing illicit activity, the one thing you'll want to do is have a software sales company, a third party, probably operating in a state that you don't have to worry too much about, selling that software. Now, reports have indicated that Systematics was in possession of the PROMIS software. Systematics, remember, represented by Hillary Clinton, Vince Foster, two people very closely connected to the Clinton administration. This is not just conjecture. They represented the company that purportedly sold this PROMIS software system across the globe. The software system would be installed into over 40 major banks, including BCCI, a bank that will come up in later episodes related to Hillary Clinton. And with Michael Riconosciuto's testimony that this would include a backdoor that was installed to allow the access to information related to money laundering and the transfer of money, you start to get the picture that something is up here. If the CIA and NSA had the ability to spy on every single wire transfer in the globe, you could very quickly get the picture that not only could they disguise money laundering for their own purposes, such as perhaps the Clinton Foundation, but they would also have the ability to see who's moving money where and take action. Now, I think it's no surprise that right around this time, during the beginning of Bill Clinton's presidency, Jeffrey Epstein, somebody who's certainly been talked about a lot lately and was the subject of a prior episode, visited the White House 13 times. That's 13 times Jeffrey Epstein showed up. Jeffrey Epstein is connected to Bob Maxwell and Ghislaine Maxwell. The interesting thing about Bob Maxwell's connection here is that Bob Maxwell, purportedly, according to an Israeli spy, sold the PROMIS software as well to Israel. Now, we know that Jeffrey Epstein was the subject of sort of a miraculous rise to wealth. Became a billionaire with one of the bigger jets that he let everybody fly on. He had his own island and he had riches. It's no coincidence that he's connected to Bob Maxwell. Bob introduced Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein. And right around this time, Jeffrey Epstein starts making visit after visit after visit to the Clinton White House. Now, what could they have been doing during these visits? Well, we don't have any official reports of what happened. Certainly, there's no record of these meetings and exactly what Jeffrey Epstein did there. But I think you can really come to the conclusion that the Clintons had very little wealth. Jeffrey Epstein, notably, according to his lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, was the person who started the Clinton Foundation. He was instrumental, according to Alan Dershowitz, in starting the Clinton Foundation. And Jeffrey Epstein visits the White House. The PROMIS software is being sold. The Clintons, through the Clinton Foundation, start to amass a massive amount of wealth. And we're not really sure how Jeffrey Epstein obtained his. And of course, Bob Maxwell can't really be asked about this because Bob Maxwell decided to take a trip on his yacht and was found floating in the water sometime after. Very, very suspicious. Now, during the famed Whitewater scandal, IRS investigators suddenly found a lot of intensity at banks in Arkansas connected to Clinton cash, cashier's checks designed to dodge reporting rules. Locals were whispering about boxes marked with medical supplies that purportedly had illicit substances. A security man's wife said she found so much cash in the trunk after a run, she had to sit on it to close the lid. Clinton's brothers recorded during a deal joking about how Bill Clinton had a nose like a vacuum cleaner. Meanwhile, in Washington, Hamilton writes this very serious letter accusing the DOJ of conversion, and he ultimately ends up being right. One branch's report reads like a bill of particulars, the other like a shrug. Through it all, Welsh and Duncan, the investigators, keep bringing binders and binders of evidence to the grand jury, only to find out that their indictments aren't signed and their subpoenas aren't allowed and they are told to back down. A skeptic might say, maybe the cases were weak, maybe the draft indictments were leveraged for cooperation, maybe the interference was just coordinated friction fair. But then why did so many different agencies tell the cops to stay away from specific names, specific people? Why do we have a number, 29 indictments, and a record of grand juries that never heard the best witnesses? Why do we have Barry Seal essentially not being able to testify because he was attacked by the cartel? Why did Hamilton's language, took, converted, stole, end up echoed by a House report as being true? The DOJ's response was a change to the question. Here's what I want to make of it. I don't need a master plan to see an outline of a system that used national security to launder accountability. Arkansas money it can't account for, and flights that it cannot explain. But it gets worse. Those duffel bags, ladies and gentlemen, dropped into fields by Barry Seal and scooped up by helicopters, didn't evaporate. They got processed, cut, bagged, and sold. They showed up in apartments, in schoolyards, in morgues, in mothers' voices that still crack when they talk about the year their boy changed. When a government lets itself believe that end runs are justified because the cause is noble, you can't call that plausible deniability. I call it cowardice. If you've been with me this far, you know I'm not here to sell you a story. I'm here to let you decide. I'm here to insist that the real questions are asked, that the real documents are examined, and the people who tried to answer them, cops like Welsh, auditors like Duncan, a founder like Hamilton, be heard. I'm here to ask that they not pay the price. If the official story tells you to stop asking questions, ask one more. If a politician tells you federal jurisdiction, back off. Ask to see the investigation anyway. If an agency tells you national security, ask whether it's protecting you or itself. And if the map I've laid out feels like a tangle, good. You're seeing it clearly. Power prefers knots. Our job is to keep tugging until the rope comes free. You get to decide. I look forward to hearing your verdict. Thanks for joining me on Off Air. I'm Ron Chapman. Feel free to check out my book, Truth and Persuasion, in a digital revolution, chock full of a lot of the information that I share on this show. Feel free to click subscribe, like, comment, tell me what you want to see, and of course, feel free to become a member. I certainly take a lot of information from the members about upcoming episodes so that we can make sure that we're hitting the stories that you want to hear and that you're able to get the facts that you need.